In 1945, a young Quaker named Charlie Lord walked through the gates of a Pennsylvania state hospital with a small camera hidden in his jacket pocket. It was an Agfa, a cheap little thing he had borrowed from a friend to take on his honeymoon, and then dropped in a lake, which is how he had ended up owning it in the first place. He was not a journalist. He was not an investigator. He was a conscientious objector, a pacifist who had refused to fight in the Second World War, and the United States government had assigned him to work as an orderly on the wards of a mental hospital in northeast Philadelphia because the war had stripped the place of nearly all of its staff. Taking photographs inside the hospital was forbidden. Charlie Lord did it anyway. He would wait until nobody was watching, pull the camera out of his pocket, and shoot without ever raising it to his eye, without even looking through the viewfinder, trying to fill the frame with what was in front of him. 36 black and white photographs came out of that camera. They showed a day room with dozens of naked men lined up along a wall. They showed human excrement smeared across corridor floors. They showed men strapped down, men huddled together with nothing on, men who had been left in a building for so long, with so little supervision, that the word neglect stops feeling adequate to describe it. When those photographs finally reached the desk of Eleanor Roosevelt, the former First Lady of the United States, she did not believe them. She looked at the images and told the men who had brought them that these must have been taken somewhere in the Deep South, in Mississippi maybe, or Alabama, where she knew such things happened. The man showing her the pictures told her the truth. They had been taken 90 miles from where she was sitting. In Philadelphia, the city of brotherly love, the hospital was called Byberry. In 1946, when Life magazine published Charlie Lord's photographs to a nation still processing the images coming out of liberated Nazi camps in Europe, the writer Albert Q. Maysel described American state hospitals as little more than concentration camps on the Belsen pattern. 2 years later, another journalist toured Byberry's wards and wrote that he had entered a building swarming with naked humans, herded like cattle, and treated with less concern. And here is the part that should stop you cold. The photographs did not close Byberry. The national uproar did not close Byberry. Eleanor Roosevelt's support did not close Byberry. Byberry stayed open for another 44 years, and its patient population did not shrink after the scandal. It grew. It reached its all-time peak of more than 7,000 people in 1960, 14 years after America had already seen exactly what was happening inside. This is the disturbing story of the Philadelphia State Hospital at Byberry. If you find these stories worth telling, take a second to subscribe. It genuinely helps keep this channel alive. Now, let's step inside. To understand how the city that considered itself the birthplace of humane psychiatric care in America ended up running one of its most notorious institutions, you have to go back before Charlie Lord's camera, before the state took control, before the first patient ever arrived. You have to go back to a poorhouse in West Philadelphia and to a piece of farmland that the city bought because it needed somewhere, anywhere, to put people it had decided it could no longer look at. Philadelphia had a genuine claim to being the cradle of American psychiatry, and that claim is essential to understanding everything that follows, because it turns this story into something closer to a tragedy than a simple horror. In 1751, Benjamin Franklin and a group of Quakers founded the Pennsylvania Hospital, the first hospital in the American colonies, and it included rooms specifically set aside for the care of the mentally ill at a time when most of the Western world was still chaining such people in cellars or driving them out of town. A generation later, a Philadelphia physician named Benjamin Rush, a signer of the Declaration of Independence, would write the first American textbook on mental illness and argue, radically for his era, that madness was a disease of the body rather than a moral failing or a demonic possession, and that it could therefore be treated and cured. History remembers him as the father of American psychiatry. His portrait still appears on the seal of the American Psychiatric Association. Benjamin Rush was born in a modest colonial house in a rural township on the far northeastern edge of Philadelphia County. The name of that township was Byberry. 150 years later, the city of Philadelphia would build one of the most notorious mental institutions in the United States, a few hundred yards from the house where the father of American psychiatry was born. Nobody planned that irony. It simply happened, the way most of the worst things in this story simply happened, through a series of decisions that each seemed reasonable to the people making them. The immediate problem, at the turn of the 20th century, was a place called Blockley. Blockley Almshouse, in West Philadelphia, was the city's institution of last resort, a combined poorhouse, charity hospital, and asylum, where the indigent, the sick, the elderly, the orphaned, and the mentally ill were all warehoused together in conditions that even by 19th century standards had become a civic embarrassment. Its insane department, formerly the Philadelphia Hospital for the Insane, was catastrophically overcrowded. The mentally ill were quartered alongside the criminally dangerous. Observers who toured the place came back with descriptions the city could not comfortably print. The solution the city arrived at was the same solution nearly every American city arrived at in that era, and the same one this channel has now traced from Long Island to Milledgeville to the outskirts of a dozen other American cities. Send them to the country. Buy farmland. Put the patients to work on it. Let fresh air, open space, and honest agricultural labor accomplish what crowded urban wards could not. In 1906, the city of Philadelphia purchased a vast tract of farmland in the Byberry section of the far northeast, some 600 acres of it, and gave the new venture a name that told you exactly what it was expected to be: Byberry City Farms. There is a detail about that land worth holding on to, because this channel has already told the story that connects to it. Before the city bought it for a mental hospital, that farmland had been worked by inmates from Holmesburg prison. The ground Byberry was built on was already prison ground. An architect named Philip H. Johnson was awarded the design contract in 1904, and he laid out the original buildings on what was called the cottage plan, in a colonial revival style, dispersed, village-like clusters of smaller structures, rather than one monolithic asylum block, a layout drawn directly from the moral treatment philosophy that held institutional rigidity itself was part of what made patients worse. Plans called for two separate groups, one for men and one for women, along with dormitories, an infirmary, a laundry, a kitchen and dining hall, an administration building, and a power plant. The first officially accepted patient at Byberry was a man named William McLean, admitted for alcoholism before the hospital had even formally opened to the public. Construction began in 1907. It was not fully complete until the late 1920s, and the reason for that delay is the single most important fact about Byberry's entire first 3 decades of existence. The money kept disappearing. Philadelphia in the first 4 decades of the 20th century was governed by one of the most durable and thoroughly entrenched political machines in the United States, an arrangement that the journalist Lincoln Steffens had already described, in a phrase that stuck to the city for generations, as corrupt and contented. And Byberry, as a city institution rather than a state one, sat directly inside that machine's reach. Historians who have gone through the surviving records describe what happened next in unusually blunt terms. Construction was delayed for years by political infighting. Directors lined their own pockets with hospital funds. Contractors awarded work through political favor, used substandard materials. Staff housing was poor, and staff pay was worse, which meant the hospital could not attract qualified caregivers even when it had the budget to hire them. The institution competed directly against the city's prisons for the same limited appropriations, and it did not usually win. Byberry, from the moment its foundations were laid, was less a medical facility than a line item that a series of city officials found useful. The patients kept arriving anyway. In 1911, with overcrowding at Blockley reaching a breaking point, the city began formally transferring inmates from its insane department out to the new facility. 2 years later, admissions to Blockley for the mentally ill stopped entirely, and Byberry became the destination for essentially every indigent psychiatric patient in Philadelphia. What the institution provided them, in the honest description of the historians who have studied it, was shelter and custodial care, usually at the most minimal levels possible, with considerable overcrowding built in from the very beginning. The pattern by which that happened is worth naming, because it is the mechanism behind nearly every institutional collapse in this series. A hospital is built with a stated capacity. That capacity appears in the founding legislation, in the architect's plans, and in every annual report thereafter. And then the number simply stops meaning anything, because nowhere in the entire chain of authority, from the committing magistrate to the transferring almshouse to the receiving superintendent, does anyone possess the power to say the institution is full and the next patient will have to go somewhere else. There is no somewhere else. That was the whole point of building it. By 1914, 3 years after the first transfers, Byberry held 2,267 people. That single institution was already, at that point, larger than any of Pennsylvania's 21 county mental institutions, and larger than 7 of the state's 8 established state hospitals. Understand what that number represents. Byberry had been designed on the cottage plan specifically to avoid warehousing, to keep patient groups small enough that something resembling individualized moral treatment remained possible. Within 3 years of opening, it was already holding a population that made that entire design philosophy meaningless, and it had another 76 years to go. Picture daily life inside those cottages in the 1920s. There is a farm, and patients work it, because that was the founding premise, and because the produce fed the institution. There is a laundry, a bakery, a barber shop. Byberry, at various points in its history, had its own baseball team, its own bowling alleys, its own ice cream parlor, its own post office. Local churches sent volunteers. Boy Scout and Girl Scout troops visited. Philadelphia's medical, nursing, and psychology students trained on the wards. On paper, in the annual reports and in the newspaper features, Byberry was a functioning community doing difficult, honorable work. Underneath that surface, the arithmetic never once worked. There were always more patients than beds, always more patients than staff, always less money than the previous year's budget request had asked for. And in an institution where the fundamental resource shortage is people, everything that gets cut first is the thing that requires a human being's time and attention. The individual conversation, the supervised activity, the bath, the clean clothing, the mopped floor. By the 1930s, the rumors coming out of Byberry had become persistent enough that a photographer for the Philadelphia Record named Mac Parker went in undercover and photographed what he found. His images verified the stories, the overcrowding, the neglect, the conditions. The resulting public outcry led to a grand jury investigation in 1936, which documented patients sleeping in hallways because there was nowhere else to put them, patients left naked because clothing was not treated as a necessity, and raw sewage found on bathroom floors during inspection. Pennsylvania's response was to take the hospital away from the city. In 1936, following the investigation, the Commonwealth assumed control of Byberry and several other city institutions, formally renaming it the Philadelphia State Hospital in 1938, under Governor George Howard Earl III. And this is the first of several moments in Byberry's history where something that looked exactly like reform arrived and changed almost nothing. The state built bigger buildings. Between 1940 and 1953, An entire second generation of construction went up across the campus, eventually bringing the total past 50 buildings. What the state did not do was fix the underlying arithmetic. Pennsylvania's largest mental hospital remained, throughout this period, one of its most poorly funded. The promise of cure remained on the paperwork. What Byberry actually delivered was custody, at or below the most basic possible level of care. It is worth pausing on the specific mechanism by which underfunding becomes cruelty, because it is not obvious, and because it recurs at every institution this channel covers. A state legislature does not vote to have patients beaten with rubber hoses. It votes on an appropriation. The appropriation determines how many attendants a hospital can hire and what it can pay them. What a hospital can pay determines who applies, and Byberry, with poor housing and worse wages, could not compete for trained personnel against literally any other employer in Philadelphia. So the institution hired whoever walked through the door. Contemporary accounts describe an administration that, facing chronic vacancies, would take essentially any applicant regardless of qualification or background. Now put that person, untrained and underpaid, alone on a ward with 300 people. He has no realistic way to provide care. He has one job that he can actually accomplish, which is to prevent the ward from erupting during his shift, and the tools available to one man facing 300 are, inevitably, tools of intimidation and physical force. Nobody in Harrisburg ever decided that. But every part of it followed, mechanically, from a budget line. Then the war came, and took what little staff the hospital had left. If you're finding this one worth your time, a like goes a long way toward keeping these deep dives alive. When the United States entered the Second World War, the Selective Service Act contained a provision for men who refused military service on religious grounds, rather than prison, which is what conscientious objectors had generally received in the First World War. These men would be assigned to what the law called work of national importance under civilian direction. The program was called Civilian Public Service, and it was administered jointly by the federal government and the three historic peace churches, the Quakers, the Mennonites, and the Church of the Brethren. Roughly 12,000 men served in civilian public service across some 150 camps. Many fought forest fires or worked on soil conservation. Some volunteered as human subjects in medical experiments, including starvation studies and infectious disease trials. Charlie Lord himself, before Byberry, had served as a test subject in a jaundice experiment. And roughly 3,000 of them were sent into America's state mental hospitals, because the hospitals were hemorrhaging staff to the draft and to better-paying wartime factory work, and somebody had to be on those wards. They served at 62 institutions across the country. In August of 1942, the American Friends Service Committee opened Civilian Public Service Camp No. 49 at Byberry, and over the 4 years that followed, 187 conscientious objectors worked those wards as attendants and orderlies. What they walked into was the war's effect on an institution that had already been failing for 35 years. The full-time staff who remained had, in the description of one objector's letters home, been reduced to a skeletal workforce. Wartime shortages meant supplies could not be maintained and infrastructure could not be repaired. Warren Sawyer, one of the objectors, wrote home describing days when ceilings and floors fell apart. Doors were nailed shut because there was no one to fix them, and lights went out because the circuit boards had failed and stayed failed. Here is the ratio, and it is the number that explains everything else. In 1944, on a given shift at Byberry, there were somewhere between 1 and 4 attendants responsible for 350 patients. At other points in the hospital's history, investigators documented a ratio of 1 attendant for every 400 people. Think about what that actually means, hour by hour. One person, sometimes untrained, often newly arrived, alone on a ward with 300 or 400 human beings, many of them severely ill, some of them violent, most of them incontinent, all of them requiring feeding, clothing, cleaning, and supervision. Under those conditions, care in any recognizable sense is not merely difficult, it is arithmetically impossible. What replaces it is control, achieved by whatever means the person on that ward can manage alone. The regular attendants had worked out what those means were long before the objectors arrived. According to the accounts the conscientious objectors compiled and later published, ward staff maintained order with sawed-off broom handles and with lengths of rubber hose filled with buckshot. Patients were placed in restraints, sometimes for months at a stretch, because a restrained patient does not require supervision. Men were left naked because there was no clothing and no one to dress them. Bedding went unwashed. The floors, in the objectors' descriptions, were sticky with urine. The objectors were also, it has to be said, spectacularly unprepared for what they had been assigned to. Most were young men in their 20s from farming communities and small towns, drawn from more than 100 different religious denominations, though concentrated among Quakers, Mennonites, and the Church of the Brethren. Almost none had any medical or psychiatric training whatsoever. Byberry did offer classes on mental illness and therapeutic treatment, but according to the records of the Civilian Public Service Unit, it routinely took over a month before a new objector received any orientation at all, which meant a young man could spend his first 4 or 5 weeks alone on a ward with several hundred severely ill people, having been told essentially nothing about any of them. The objectors, whose entire reason for being at Byberry, rather than in a rifle company, was a religious commitment to nonviolence, could not participate in any of it. So they tried something else, and Warren Sawyer later described the result in a sentence that is almost unbearably simple. "We improved things," he said, "just by the fact that we weren't beating the patients. Fighting on the wards lessened," he explained, because the patients came to understand that these particular attendants would stop a fight without becoming part of it. That was the extent of the reform 200 pacifists could accomplish from inside the system. On their shifts, on their wards, the violence went down, because they personally refused to commit any. It was not enough, and they knew it was not enough. So they began, carefully and deliberately, to build a case. They wrote letters to newspaper editors. One objector drafted letters for patients' relatives to sign when they came to visit, so that the complaints would come from families rather than from staff who could be dismissed. They compared notes with objectors at other institutions across the country, filling out questionnaires and writing narratives about what they were witnessing, until the collected reports of more than 3,000 men working in 20 states had accumulated into something no individual hospital administrator could dismiss as an isolated grievance. One building on the campus concentrated the worst of everything, and every account from the period converges on it. It was designated, in the institution's characteristically flat administrative vocabulary, simply as Building B. Building B was where the patients nobody else could manage ended up. A Philadelphia Record headline from February of 1946 described it, quoting the hospital's own leadership, in terms no public relations office would have chosen: dank, overcrowded, and receiving what the article called the dregs of the mental cases. It was the building Charlie Lord photographed. It was the building Warren Sawyer described in his letters home. And it was, by every surviving account, the building where the ratio of one attendant to several hundred patients produced its most complete collapse. Consider what a day looked like inside it. Men were held in a large open ward, many with no clothing at all, because clothing had to be issued, laundered, and replaced, and there was no one available to do any of those things reliably. Incontinence went unattended, which meant the floors and the men themselves stayed soiled for extended periods. There was no meaningful programming, no therapy, no organized activity, because activity requires supervision, and supervision requires staff. So the men simply existed in that room, hour after hour, day after day, in what Life magazine would eventually caption with a single word: idleness. That word, printed under a photograph in 1946, is easy to read past. Sit with what it actually described. Not a treatment that failed, not a therapy that turned out to be barbaric. Simply nothing at all, administered to several hundred severely ill human beings, for years. In February of 1946, the Philadelphia Record ran a front-page article, headlined with a state official's own candid assessment that Byberry's Building B remained a disgrace. When Pennsylvania's Secretary of Welfare visited to inspect that building, her recorded criticism was not of the conditions. It was of the conscientious objectors for writing letters instead of simply cleaning the wards themselves. And somewhere in the middle of all of this, Charlie Lord decided that letters were not going to be enough either. Lord was a Quaker from a family of Quakers, and he described his own motivation in terms that never wavered across the 60-odd years he lived afterward. He had, he said, a Christian and Quaker attitude of wanting to help people and to do something good with his life, and he simply thought the outside world needed to know what conditions were like in that hospital. The rules said no cameras. He brought the camera. The 36 photographs he took inside buildings A and B in 1945 are, and this is worth saying plainly, extraordinary photographs, and not only for what they depict. Lord was a genuinely skilled photographer, and the images are carefully composed, even though he shot most of them blind, from the hip, without raising the camera to his eye. He understood exactly what he needed. Get close, he told himself. Fill the frame. Do not have little people far away. He knew, with a clarity that comes through in every interview he gave for the rest of his life, precisely why the photographs mattered more than anything he or the other objectors could write. The evidence, he said, is right there before you. It's not somebody's writing to describe something. They can use flowery words. But if the photograph is there, you can't deny it. The first significant person to see them was Eleanor Roosevelt in September of 1945. Her husband, Franklin Roosevelt, had died only months earlier. A meeting was arranged between the former First Lady and two of the Byberry objectors, and when one of them, Hal Barton, described the conditions to her, she did not believe him. Then Barton produced Charlie Lord's photographs, and Eleanor Roosevelt's reaction, as Lord recounted it decades afterward, was immediate and involuntary. "Oh, my stars," she said. "What in the world? This must have been in the deep South." She told them she knew about conditions like that in Mississippi, in Alabama. Barton told her no, it was within 90 miles of where they were sitting. Eleanor Roosevelt kept her word. She recruited influential friends to serve as sponsors for the small mental health foundation the objectors were building, and she wrote about what she had seen to government health officials and to journalists. The dam broke in the spring of 1946. In mid-April, the journalist Albert Deutsch published a series of articles in the magazine PM. Less than 3 weeks later, on the 6th of May 1946, Life magazine published Albert Q. Maisel's exposé under a title that entered the language, Bedlam, 1946, subtitled with the flat declaration that most United States mental hospitals were a shame and a disgrace. The article covered two institutions in detail, Pennsylvania's Byberry and Ohio's Cleveland State Hospital. It ran Charlie Lord's photographs with one-word captions: idleness, nakedness, crowding. Maisel was careful to establish that this was not a matter of one journalist's impressions. He wrote that in addition to his own observations at a dozen hospitals, and in addition to court records and the reports of occasional investigating commissions, there was now available for the first time a reliable body of data covering nearly a third of all the state hospitals in 20 states, from Washington to Virginia, from Maine to Utah. That body of data was the collated reports of more than 3,000 conscientious objectors. The pacifists had built exactly the case they set out to build. And then Maisel wrote the sentence that detonated. American state hospitals, he said, were little more than concentration camps on the Belsen pattern. Understand the moment that sentence landed in. It was May of 1946. Belsen had been liberated 13 months earlier. The photographs from the German camps had run in the same magazine, in some cases on the same kind of full-page black and white spreads. American readers looking at Charlie Lord's picture of naked men lined up along a day room wall were looking at a composition their eyes had already been trained, that same year, to recognize. 2 years later, in his 1948 book, The Shame of the States, Albert Deutsch described his own tour of Byberry's wards in terms that made the comparison explicit and personal. As he passed through some of Byberry's wards, he wrote, he was reminded of the pictures of the Nazi concentration camps. He described entering a building swarming with naked humans, herded like cattle, and treated with less concern, pervaded by a stench so heavy and so nauseating that it seemed to have an almost physical presence of its own. It is worth being precise about what Maisel's article actually argued, because the concentration camp line is the part everyone remembers, and it was not, in fact, his central point. Maisel's argument was structural. He traced the failure directly to what he called public neglect and legislative penny-pinching, and he laid out how, state after state, institutions founded for the care and cure of the mentally sick had been allowed to degenerate into something else entirely. He documented that the Cleveland end of the story had begun back in 1943, when conscientious objectors at Cleveland State Hospital brought a stack of sworn affidavits, a foot high, to 2 prominent local citizens, one of them a newspaperman named Walter Lurch, who verified the claims himself and broke the story on the front page of the Cleveland Press in October of 1943, then kept publishing evidence day after day, proving the beating and shackling of patients, the revolting food, the overcrowding, the low salaries, and the absence of treatment. In other words, the machinery of exposure had been running for 3 full years before Life ever printed a photograph, and officials had spent those 3 years dismissing it. The uproar was national, and it was genuine. The conscientious objectors, refusing to simply hand the problem back to the government that had created it, founded their own organization, the National Mental Health Foundation, to keep pressing for reform after the war ended. It later merged into what would become the National Mental Health Association, an advocacy body that still exists today. The reporting genuinely did change the national conversation about institutional psychiatry, and it fed directly into the reform movements that would, over the following 2 decades, begin dismantling the entire state hospital system. We put hundreds of hours into each of these. If that's worth something to you, hit subscribe. And now, the myth correction, because this is where the popular version of Byberry's story and the documented version part company completely. The way this story usually gets told, online and in the ghost tour version of Philadelphia history, is that Charlie Lord's photographs exposed Byberry, the nation was horrified, and reform followed. The first 2 parts of that are true. The third is not, and the actual record is considerably more damning than the tidy version. Byberry did not close after 1946. It did not shrink after 1946. Its population continued to climb for another 14 years, reaching its all-time peak of more than 7,000 patients in 1960, in a hospital operating at roughly 75% above its intended capacity. Life magazine had to come back and publish a second exposé on Byberry in 1951, 5 years after the first one. In 1970, dozens of patient deaths at the hospital were reported as attributable to neglect. The final decision to close Byberry did not come until December of 1987, 41 years after the photographs ran. Charlie Lord's photographs are, without exaggeration, among the most consequential images in the history of American mental health advocacy. They helped change national policy. They helped build an advocacy movement that outlived everyone involved in taking them. And they did not save a single patient inside the building where they were taken, because a national scandal, however genuine, does not by itself put staff on a ward or money in a budget line. That gap between what a photograph can accomplish and what it cannot is the actual story of Byberry. There was one thing that did change at Byberry in the years immediately after the scandal, and it did not come from a reformer, a legislature, or a journalist. It came from a pharmaceutical company headquartered a few miles away in downtown Philadelphia. Smith, Kline and French was a Philadelphia drug company, with roots going back to a Chestnut Street pharmacy in 1830. In 1952, the firm purchased the American rights to a compound that a French pharmaceutical company had synthesized and that French psychiatrists had begun using, with startling results, on patients with schizophrenia. The compound was chlorpromazine. Smith, Kline, and French brought it to market in the United States in 1954 under the trade name thorazine, and it became the first drug in human history that could effectively treat a major mental illness. Within 8 months of reaching the American market, thorazine had been administered to more than 2 million patients. It was initially marketed, in a phrase the company's own advertising used without apparent embarrassment, as a chemical lobotomy, which was fitting in the bleakest possible way, because one of the treatments it was replacing was the actual lobotomy. Sales of that single drug kept Smith, Kline, and French afloat into the 1970s and turned a mid-sized regional firm into a pharmaceutical giant, one that would eventually merge and merge again into what is today one of the largest drug companies on earth. Byberry's patients were part of how the company got there. Smith, Kline, and French partnered with the hospital, as it did with state hospitals across the country, to run drug trials on the patient population. Byberry's patients were, from a research standpoint, an ideal group, thousands of them, permanently confined, closely monitored, and, critically, largely without family members positioned to ask difficult questions. Many patients at Byberry had no relatives visiting at all. Many were not, by any reasonable standard, capable of giving informed consent to participate in a pharmaceutical trial, and the concept of informed consent as a legal requirement barely existed in American medicine in the 1950s in any case. And here is where Byberry's story loops back to the ground the hospital was built on, and to another Philadelphia institution this channel has already covered. Byberry's land had once been farmed by inmates from Holmesburg prison, a few miles to the south. In 1951, the same decade Smith, Kline, and French was running trials on Byberry's patients. A University of Pennsylvania dermatologist named Albert Kligman walked into Holmesburg prison, looked at the inmate population, and later described what he saw in a sentence that became the title of the book that eventually exposed him. "All I saw before me," Kligman said, "were acres of skin." For the next 23 years, Holmesburg's prisoners were paid a few dollars a patch to serve as test subjects for cosmetics companies, pharmaceutical firms, Dow Chemical, and the United States Army, which commissioned Kligman to test hallucinogenic and psychotropic compounds on them. Two institutions, a few miles apart, in the same city, in the same decade. One held people the courts had convicted. One held people the courts had committed. Both were understood, by the researchers who came through their gates, as populations that could not effectively refuse. The city of Philadelphia finally issued a formal apology for the Holmesburg experiments in October of 2022, 71 years after they began. No comparable apology has ever been issued for what was done at Byberry. None of this means thorazine was a fraud, and it would be a serious distortion of the record to suggest it. Chlorpromazine was, by any honest measure, one of the most consequential drugs of the 20th century. It was the first compound that could reliably suppress the symptoms of psychosis, and its arrival made it possible for hundreds of thousands of people who would otherwise have spent their entire adult lives inside institutions like Byberry to live outside them instead. In the United States, the inpatient population of mental institutions peaked at roughly 559,000 in 1955, the year after thorazine reached the market, and had fallen to 452,000 a decade later. The drug worked. The question Byberry raises is not whether the drug worked. It is who was made to establish that it worked, and under what conditions they were asked, and whether anyone in a position to say no had any real capacity to say it. The drugs did eventually empty the hospital, though not as quickly as the popular history suggests, and the 1960s were the beginning of the long end. Mental health advocates began questioning the fundamental premise of warehousing thousands of people in institutions at all. Federal policy shifted decisively toward community-based care. The population that had peaked above 7,000 in 1960 began to fall, and it kept falling, decade after decade. There is one more structural failure at Byberry that ran through its entire existence, and that the reform coverage of the 1940s barely touched, because it was not a matter of staffing or funding, but of category. Byberry, throughout its history, held wildly different populations inside the same walls. The institution's own descriptions list them without much distinction. People with severe mental illness, people with intellectual disabilities, people committed for alcoholism, and, in a dedicated forensic unit, individuals the courts had classified as criminally insane. The whole founding argument for building Byberry in the first place had been that the mentally ill were being quartered with the dangerously criminal at Blockley, and that this was intolerable. Byberry then spent the next 80 years doing a version of the same thing on its own campus. Warren Sawyer, the conscientious objector, made an observation in a later interview that historians researching the institution found significant enough to record. The military, during the war years, used Byberry as a dumping ground for problematic soldiers. Men who had become unmanageable in uniform for whatever combination of psychiatric illness and disciplinary trouble were routed into a civilian state hospital that had neither the staff nor the security to handle them, and placed on wards alongside patients who had been committed for chronic schizophrenia decades earlier. Repeated state inspections in the 1970s and 1980s flagged the mixing of violent offenders with the general patient population as a persistent, unresolved failure. In 1970 alone, dozens of patient deaths at Byberry were reported as attributable to neglect. Reporting from the period describes stretches during which the institution was recording a death roughly every week to 10 days, and the local press documented violent deaths occurring in sequence. In one case, a patient dying of injuries sustained in an altercation with another patient who had been admitted only about 24 hours before the fight. But a shrinking population did not make Byberry a better place. In some ways, it made it worse, because the patients who remained longest were, by definition, the ones for whom no community placement could be found, the most severely ill, the most difficult, the ones with no family left to advocate for them. And the institution holding them was, by the 1980s, a set of buildings dating in part to 1907 that the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania had spent 80 years underfunding. By 1987, Byberry's census had fallen to roughly 500 patients, down from more than 7,000 at its peak. The state was spending more per patient than at any point in the institution's history, and the conditions inside had not improved. Pennsylvania's own Secretary of Welfare would describe Byberry, in that period, as the worst and most expensively run institution in the entire state mental care system. Investigators documented patients held in restraints for days and weeks at a stretch. One man, according to the reporting, was kept in 4-point restraints, wrists and ankles secured, for more than a year. And it was a patient, not an inspector, who finally broke it open. Her name was Anna Jennings. She was a young woman confined at Byberry, and she was one of a substantial number of patients on those wards who had survived childhood sexual abuse before they ever arrived, and who were now being subjected, in the name of treatment, to physical restraint by staff, an experience that clinicians now understand as one of the most reliable ways to re-traumatize an abuse survivor. At one point, while she was in restraints, Anna Jennings told a psychologist at Byberry what had been done to her as a child. The psychologist's response was to apologize to her, because he understood exactly what being tied down meant for someone with her history, and he was doing it anyway, because that was how the institution operated. That detail deserves to be stated as plainly as possible, because it is the single clearest illustration of what Byberry had become by the 1980s. A trained clinician, standing in front of a restrained patient who had just disclosed a history of childhood sexual abuse, understood well enough what the restraints were doing to her to offer an apology for them, and then left her in them, because the institution had no other way to operate. The knowledge was there. The clinical understanding was there. The capacity to act on either was not. Anna Jennings got the truth about Byberry out through those walls, at genuine personal risk. Staff members, some of whom had spent years watching what was happening, took a public stand alongside her, and the combination of patient testimony and staff whistleblowing finally produced something that 4 decades of journalism had not. In the summer of 1987, after Byberry once again failed a state inspection, 5 of the hospital's top officials were fired outright. Pennsylvania's governor, Robert Casey, ordered a comprehensive survey of the institution. The investigating teams came back and described conditions at Byberry with 2 words that ended the argument permanently: atrocious and irreversible. On the 7th of December 1987, a press conference was held to announce that the Philadelphia State Hospital at Byberry would close. The following day, the Philadelphia Daily News reported that the fired officials had been removed after the hospital was cited for a history of neglect, poor management, absence of treatment, and rampant abuse. Byberry was supposed to close in 1988. It did not. And the reason is one of the quietest and most damning details in this entire story. 2 patients, who had been released from Byberry as part of the closure process, were found dead in the Delaware River on 2 successive days. The institution that had failed them on the inside had now failed them on the way out, discharged into a community care system that was not remotely prepared to receive the population Byberry. Byberry had spent 80 years accumulating. Those 2 deaths point at the argument that has never been settled about Byberry, and about every institution like it that America closed in the same decades. Byberry deserved to close. Nothing in the documented record admits any other conclusion. But closing an institution and building the thing that replaces it are 2 entirely different projects, and Pennsylvania, like nearly every other state, was substantially better at the first than the second. The Encyclopedia of Greater Philadelphia describes what happened as the unbundling of psychiatric care for the seriously mentally ill. The total institution, whatever its horrors, had at least been a single place where a person's housing, food, medication, and supervision all came from one address. What replaced it was a patchwork of community programs delivered by private nonprofit agencies, and a person who fell through a gap between 2 of those agencies fell all the way through. There is a version of this story's ending that is genuinely hopeful, and it should be told alongside the rest. Reporting done 25 years after the closure found former Byberry patients living in the normalized community and doing, in the words of that coverage, just fine. People who had spent years inside that institution and who, given actual community support, built ordinary lives outside it. That happened. It is real, and it is the strongest available argument that closing the place was right. And 2 people came out of that same closure process and were pulled from the Delaware River on consecutive days. Both things are true about the same policy, executed in the same year, on the same population. The closure process slowed. It took another 2.5 years. In June of 1990, the Philadelphia State Hospital at Byberry released its last 2 patients and closed its doors permanently, 79 years after the first transfers arrived from Blockley. The remaining patients and staff went to Norristown State Hospital or into local community programs. If this story is hitting different from the version you've heard before, that's the point. Consider subscribing so you don't miss the next one. What happened to the buildings afterward is its own strange coda, and it explains why an entire generation of Philadelphians has a personal Byberry story that has nothing to do with psychiatry. The plan was to demolish the campus in 1991. That plan collapsed almost immediately when surveyors found asbestos throughout the structures on a scale nobody had budgeted for. Abatement contractors estimated $16 million simply to remove the asbestos, a figure that did not include the demolition itself. Faced with that number, the Commonwealth did what governments generally do with a problem that expensive and that invisible. Nothing. For 15 years. More than 50 buildings sat empty on the far northeastern edge of Philadelphia. Looters broke in within weeks of the closure and stripped the copper wiring and plumbing. Vandals smashed the windows and set fires. And into that vacuum came a subculture that barely had a name yet in the early 1990s and would eventually be called urban exploration. Byberry became one of the single most visited abandoned sites in the United States, and there is something worth examining in why. Part of it was simply scale, 50-plus buildings, open to anyone willing to climb through a broken window, on the edge of a major American city with easy road access. Part of it was the tunnels, but part of it, and the explorers who documented the place have said this themselves, was that the buildings still had the institution's history physically present inside them. Patient records left in filing cabinets, furniture, fixtures, rooms whose function was still obvious from what remained in them. For 15 years, the most accessible archive of what Byberry had actually been was the building itself, deteriorating, unsecured, and being carried off, piece by piece, by scrappers and souvenir hunters. Nobody was cataloging it. The Commonwealth was not preserving it. What the site had to say about 80 years of institutional failure was available to anyone who trespassed, and to nobody else, right up until the machines arrived. A genuine community formed around it over the course of the decade, and then, in the early 2000s, the internet brought a flood of new visitors who had read about it online. The tunnels running beneath the campus, built to connect the buildings, became their own attraction, spoken about in the same breath as catacombs. It was dangerous, and not theoretically so. In February of 2005, an officer of an environmental services company inspecting the property for demolition fell and was killed on the grounds. The demolition finally came in 2006. On the 14th of June, a ceremony was held on the site to mark the complete leveling of the Philadelphia State Hospital at Byberry. The buildings that had housed more than 7,000 people, that Charlie Lord had photographed, that Albert Deutsch had compared to Belsen, came down under the machines of a Philadelphia demolition contractor, and the tunnels underneath were filled in. What stands there now is worth describing precisely, because it is the part of this story that is still being written. The site was sold to the Philadelphia Authority for Industrial Development in 2004 for $850,000, and Westrom Development Company built, on a slice of the former hospital grounds, a residential community called the Arbors at Eagle Point. It opened its first model homes in 2008, with the mayor of Philadelphia attending the ribbon cutting. 332 units of single homes, townhomes, and carriage homes, arranged around a clubhouse, with a library, a card room, a fitness center, a billiards room, a pub, and an outdoor pool. It is an active adult community. Residency is restricted to people aged 55 and older. Think about the arithmetic of that for a moment. A person who moved into the arbors at Eagle Point when it opened, at the minimum qualifying age of 55, was born around 1953. They were a small child when Byberry's population peaked at 7,000. They were a teenager in Philadelphia when dozens of patients were dying there of neglect in 1970. They were in their 30s when the state called the conditions atrocious and irreversible. And they bought a house with a pub and a card room built on that exact ground. The engineers who prepared the site have documented the specific challenges of building there. The existing tunnel network connecting the old buildings had to be located and demolished. There was an underground stream running through the property that had to be diverted into a culvert. Groundwater conditions and what the geotechnical report politely calls miscellaneous urban fills complicated everything, across 55 acres. 25 acres of the original site were set aside as permanent open space that will never be developed. The rest went to industry. The former hospital grounds are today largely occupied by the Byberry industrial parks, logistics centers, distribution facilities, warehouses. In late 2023, the Rockefeller Group announced 2 additional warehouses totaling 650,000 square feet on the parcel facing Roosevelt Boulevard, built speculatively with no tenant lined up, scheduled for completion in the middle of 2025. The project sits inside a Keystone Opportunity Zone, which means whichever business eventually occupies it will receive substantial state and local tax abatements for a decade. A director on the project, asked about building there, said that he looked forward to redeveloping the site, especially considering the history, and noted that a lot of the properties his firm pursues have that type of story. Superfund sites, functionally obsolete sites, sites that had become more of an eyesore. It should be said that Byberry has not gone entirely undocumented. 2 books appeared within weeks of each other in 2013. One a narrative history by J.P. Webster, and one a photographic volume by Hannah Karena Jones. And between them, they preserved a great deal that would otherwise have been lost with the buildings. Independent documentaries have been made. Charlie Lord's 36 photographs survive and are still published. But documentation by private individuals is not the same as public acknowledgement by the institutions responsible. There is no memorial at Byberry. There is no plaque. There is no marker on that ground identifying what happened there. No list of names. No acknowledgement at the entrance to the housing development or on the wall of any warehouse. The tax abatement is documented. The geotechnical survey is documented. The tunnels were located, mapped, and destroyed with professional thoroughness. The people are not commemorated anywhere on the site at all. Zoom out from Byberry, and the shape of the story is one this channel has now traced through asylum after asylum, prison after prison. An institution is founded on a genuinely humane premise. Get these people out of the poorhouse, out of the jail, out of the crowded urban ward, and give them land, air, work, and a chance. The institution fills past capacity almost immediately because no one ever builds in a mechanism to refuse the next admission. Underfunding turns care into custody. Custody, administered by too few people, turns into control. Control, in the absence of anyone watching, turns into the broom handle and the rubber hose. But Byberry has a feature that sets it apart from almost every other institution in this series, and it is the reason this story is worth an hour of your time. At Byberry, somebody was watching. Somebody photographed it. Somebody got those photographs to the most admired woman in America, and she believed them and used her name. The biggest magazine in the country published them, alongside a comparison to Belson that no reader in 1946 could have misunderstood. A generation of pacifists founded a national advocacy organization specifically to make sure it kept happening. And the hospital's population went up for another 14 years. That is the fact this story exists, to make you sit with. Byberry was not a secret. It was not hidden away in some rural county where nobody thought to look. It was inside the city limits of the sixth largest city in the United States, 17 miles from the center of a city that considered itself the birthplace of American psychiatric medicine, a few hundred yards from the house where Benjamin Rush was born. And it had been the subject of a national scandal, a grand jury investigation, undercover newspaper photography, 2 separate Life magazine exposés, and a best-selling book, and it stayed open for another 4 decades anyway. Exposure is not the same as accountability. Outrage is not the same as funding. A photograph can change what a nation believes and still fail to change what happens on a ward the following Tuesday, because what happens on that ward depends on how many people the state is willing to pay to be standing in it. Charlie Lord lived to be 90. He became a professional photographer and a social worker, and he spent his later years in Quaker retirement communities, first in Pennsylvania and finally in Tennessee, where a national public radio reporter found him in 2009, at 89, still able to open an old copy of Life and point at the picture. "Here's the original one," he said. "Here, 1946. This is the day room with dozens of naked men along the left wall. It was just terrible neglect." He died a month after that interview aired, in January of 2010. He never expressed regret about breaking the rule. "Let's just thank God," he said, "for giving me the opportunity to do this." The men in his photographs have no names attached to them. They exist in the historical record as compositions: the day room, the corridor, the wall, idleness, nakedness, crowding. Anna Jennings got her truth out of Byberry and helped close it, and the 2 patients discharged during that closure were found in the Delaware River on consecutive days. And on the ground where all of it happened, there is now a clubhouse with a card room, and 2 speculative warehouses with a 10-year tax abatement, and 25 acres of open space, and no plaque. So the question Byberry leaves is not whether anyone knew. Everyone knew. The question is what it actually takes, in this country, for knowing to be enough. If you made it all the way to the end of this one, you already know exactly what this channel is about and what it stands for. Subscribe so you don't miss the next deep dive.